The air in the grand ballroom of the Seaview Country Club was thick with the smell of expensive perfume, starched linen, and unspoken judgments. Crystal glasses clinked, a sound as sharp and brittle as the smiles of the guests. Everyone who was, anyone in Crestwood Bluffs, or who desperately wanted to be, was here. They had come to witness the unlikely marriage of Leo Sterling, the neighborhood's very own titan of real estate, to his new wife. Her name was Elena. She stood beside Leo at the head of the room, a slight figure in a column of simple, unadorned ivory silk. Next to Leo's imposing, broad-shouldered frame in his tailored tuxedo, she seemed almost to fade into the background, a soft watercolor next to a bold oil painting. Leo was in his element, his silver hair perfectly combed, his laugh a loud, confident bark that cut through the murmur of the crowd. He gestured widely as he talked to a cluster of his friends, all men who looked like variations of himself, successful, slightly weathered, used to getting what they wanted. Elena's hands were clasped lightly in front of her. She smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. Those eyes, a quiet shade of hazel, moved slowly across the room, taking in the dizzying swirl of faces she didn't know. The women here were a masterpiece of maintenance, sleek hair, smooth skin stretched just taut enough, diamonds glittering at throats and wrists like frozen tears. Their gazes, when they flicked towards Elena, were quick and assessing, like birds pecking for seeds. A waiter glided by with a tray of champagne flutes. Leo snatched two, handing one to Elena without pausing his story about a contentious land deal. And I told him, if he thinks he can undercut me on the waterfront property, he's got another thing coming. He boomed. Elena took the glass, her fingers careful on the stem. She took a tiny, polite sip, the bubbles feeling sharp and foreign on her tongue. The whispers had started the moment the engagement was announced, and they were in full, buzzing flight tonight. 20 years, at least, murmured a woman in a severe black dress to her companion, her eyes like chips of flint. Maybe more. He's what, 68? 69, the companion corrected, sipping her wine. And she can't be a day over 42. If that. Eastern European, I heard. Probably met her on one of those travel companion websites. A knowing nod. Exactly. A professional caretaker with a pretty face. Leo's no fool. He knows he needs someone to look after him in his old age. This is just a long-term contract with benefits. The words, fragments of them anyway, drifted on the air. Asterisk gold digger. Mail order bride. Nurse with a ring. Asterisk Elena heard them not as sentences, but as a low, unpleasant hum, like the drone of a distant appliance. She understood more English than people assumed, but she had learned long ago that silence was often the safest harbor. Leo steered her through the crowd, a firm hand on the small of her back. "Martin, good to see you. This is Elena, my wife." His voice was full of pride, but it was the pride of ownership, of presenting a newly acquired, exquisite object. Martin, a man with a hearty red face, shook Leo's hand vigorously and gave Elena an appraising look. "Charmed," he said. "Leo, you old dog, finally found someone to keep you in line?" He laughed, a gusty sound. "She's a calming influence," Leo said, squeezing her shoulder. "Travels well, doesn't complain. Finds the best little cafes off the beaten path." Alana's smile remained fixed. She was being described like a useful pet or a quiet, efficient car. She caught the glance between Martin and his wife, a flicker of pity mixed with disdain. The wife, a woman with taut, blonde hair, leaned in. "And what did you do before, dear? Before you and Leo traveled?" It was the question she dreaded. The past was a country she had closed the borders to. "I was in hospitality," Elena said softly, her accent lending a musical lilt to the word. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had welcomed people. She had served. Oh, like a hotel? The woman pressed, her interest purely clinical. Something like that? Elena said, letting her gaze drop modestly. It was easier to let them think what they wanted. A hotel clerk, a tour guide. It fit their story neatly. The dinner was a long, exquisite torture of multiple forks and subtle slights. Seated between a bored hedge fund manager and Leo's brusque lawyer, Elena navigated the conversation like a miner in a dark tunnel, offering only yes, no, and it is beautiful. She watched the other women at the table, the effortless way they discussed summer homes, college admission scandals, and the merits of different plastic surgeons. Their world was built on a foundation of money and social maneuvering that felt alien to her. She thought of her own mother, her hands worn from kneading dough, filling their small apartment with the smell of garlic and rosemary. She thought of the sound of a different kind of music, not this bland orchestral cover of pop songs from the band in the corner, but something alive, something that spoke of deep forests and vast, aching skies. A wave of loneliness, so profound it was almost physical, washed over her. She gripped her water glass to steady herself. Finally, the ordeal moved to the Sterling mansion for a more intimate gathering. The house was a monument to Leo's. Success all sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the inky blackness of the ocean, and cool, minimalist furniture that looked untouched by human life. In the vast, white living room, a new object stood prominently. It was a piano. A long, sleek, black digital piano with a polished surface that reflected the recessed lights like a still, dark pool. It was the most beautiful, soulless thing Elena had ever seen. A little wedding gift for the house, Leo announced to a small group of lingering guests. He walked over and patted its lid with a proprietorial slap. A kawaii novice, state-of-the-art, silent playing, recording, the works. Beautiful, isn't it? Elena appreciates the finer things. All eyes turned to her. She could feel their collective thought. Asterisk, what would she know about it? Asterisk, she approached the instrument slowly. The air around it seemed colder. She reached out, and with one finger, she touched the fallboard, the cover that hid the keys. It was smooth and cool as ice. It is very impressive, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cost a fortune, Leo chuckled, putting an arm around her. But nothing but the best for my girl. Maybe you can learn a little tune on it. HM? Something for cocktail parties. A few of the guests chuckled politely. The image was complete. The aging tycoon, buying culture in a box for his young, uneducated bride, who would doubtless tinker clumsily with it before losing interest. Elena simply nodded, her hand falling away from the piano. Thank you, Leo. It is a beautiful gift. Later, when the last guest had left with exaggerated farewells, and the mansion was plunged into a deep, echoing quiet, Elena stood alone in the living room. The only light came from the moon over the ocean, casting the piano in a pale, ghostly glow. She didn't open it. She didn't sit down. She just stood there, looking at this symbol of a life she never asked for. The silence in the house was absolute, but inside her, a storm of memory and music raged, a symphony locked in a vault. The polished black surface of the kawaii novice stared back at her, a closed door. For now, and for the sake of the peace she had bargained for, she would keep it locked. She turned off the light and walked up the wide, cold staircase to the bedroom, leaving the piano alone in the dark, a silent, waiting stranger in a house built on whispers. The wedding flowers wilted and were thrown away. The congratulatory cards were filed in a drawer, out of sight. Life in the Sterling mansion settled into a pattern as precise and cold as the lines of its architecture. Elena learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Leo liked his coffee black and scalding at 6:45 a.m., just as the financial news flickered to life on the screen in his study. She learned that the housekeeper came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and that the gardener, a quiet man who never made eye contact, tended to the sharp-edged ornamental shrubs every Thursday. She learned to stay out of the way. Her role, it seemed, was to be a pleasant, quiet presence, a living part of the decor. Leo was often gone, his life a whirlwind of meetings, lunches, and golf games that were really more meetings. When he was home, he talked at her, not to her. He told her about deals, about stubborn city council members, about the declining quality of service at his favorite steakhouse. He showed her the artwork he'd bought on a business trip, a harsh, geometric sculpture that looked like a twisted piece of metal. Important work, he'd said, very valuable. Elena would nod and say it was interesting, which seemed to please him. His 2 adult children from his first marriage visited sometimes. They were polite in a way that felt like a door being held open for a stranger, a brief, impersonal courtesy. His son, a younger version of Leo with a tighter jaw, would talk stocks with his father and throw the occasional glance at Elena that was neither warm nor cold, simply acknowledging her existence as one might a new piece of furniture. His daughter was sharper. She'd look around the immaculate kitchen, her eyes missing nothing. Once, she'd pointedly asked Elena if she needed help finding a good housekeeping service, her tone implying the job might be too much for her. "The housekeeper is very good," Elena had replied softly. "But thank you?" The daughter had just smiled, a thin line of a smile. "Of course, Dad does like things just so." They never asked about her life before. They had already written the story. Their father, getting older, perhaps lonely, certainly vain, had picked a pretty, uncomplicated companion from somewhere far away. It was a transaction, they understood. She provided company and care. He provided security. It was almost respectable in its bluntness. They treated her with a distant, careful civility, the kind you show someone who is providing a service. The piano sat untouched in the living room. It became a talking point for Leo when he had people over for the business dinners he sometimes insisted on hosting. "My wife's piano," he'd say, guiding a colleague past it. "Top of the line. I believe in supporting the arts, you know." He'd give the lid an affectionate pat, as if it were a well-behaved dog. The colleagues would murmur appreciatively. Elena, usually in the kitchen arranging canapes on a slate board or stirring a sauce, would hear it. She'd feel a strange twist in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It was more like a deep, hollow sadness. One evening, Leo had a few of his more aggressive friends over. The talk was loud and centered on money. Who lost it? Who made a killing? Who was a fool? Elena moved silently around the edges of the room, refilling glasses. One of the men, his face flushed with wine, was holding forth on a younger business rival. "The kid's soft," the man declared, his voice booming. "Thinks he can win people over with vision and community. Has no spine. No teeth. I told him in this game, you eat or you get eaten. There's no prize for being nice." Leo laughed, a sound of agreement. Sentimentality is a luxury for those who can't afford the price of winning. The words seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the cigar smoke. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she poured more whiskey into a glass. The conversation felt brutal, a world away from any kindness she had ever known. She finished her tasks and slipped away, the loud, grating laughter following her down the hallway. She didn't go upstairs. Instead, she found herself drawn to the living room. The lights were off. The huge windows showed nothing but the reflection of the dark room, and beyond, the faint suggestion of the ocean, a vast black emptiness. She walked to the piano. In the darkness, it was just a shape, a great silent beast. She sat on the bench, the leather cool through her thin dress. She didn't open the fallboard. She didn't need to see the keys. In her mind, she could see them perfectly. The smooth ivory, the sharp black. She could feel their weight under her fingers, the slight resistance before the hammer struck the string. She placed her hands in her lap, palms up, and just sat there. In the quiet dark, the noise from the dining room was muffled, just a dull rumble of aggression. Here, it was still. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in that house, she let herself remember. Not with her mind, but with her body. The memory was a feeling. It was the specific ache in her shoulders after 6 hours of practice as a teenager. It was the thrill of a phrase played perfectly, a feeling like flight. It was the warm, wooden smell of her teacher's old, upright piano, so different from the sterile electronic scent of this one. It was the sound of her mother humming along from the kitchen to a melody Elena was composing, a simple, sad little tune. A single hot tear escaped from under her closed eyelid and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. In this darkness, she didn't have to be the calm, grateful wife. She could be herself for just a moment. A self that felt terribly, terribly lost. Suddenly, the overhead lights blazed on, harsh and shocking. Leo stood in the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame. He blinked, looking confused and slightly irritated. There you are. What are you doing sitting in the dark? Feeling unwell? The spell was shattered. The memories fled back into their locked room. Elena quickly smoothed her dress and stood up, turning to him with the familiar, placid smile already back on her face. It felt like putting on a mask. No. I am fine, she said, her voice soft and even. I was just admiring it. It is such a beautiful gift. Thank you, Leo. He looked from her to the piano and back, his businessman's mind trying to solve a puzzle with no obvious profit or loss. He shrugged, the concern evaporating. Well, don't sit in the dark. It's depressing. Come on, they're about to break out the good port. You should try it. He turned and walked back towards the noise and the light. Elena took one last look at the silent, glossy piano. She touched the closed lid once, a fleeting goodbye. Then she followed her husband, her steps quiet on the polished floor, leaving the beautiful, unplayed gift alone once more in the vast, quiet room. To Leo, to his children, to everyone, her words had just been polite gratitude from a simple woman. Her quiet retreat into the dark was just a minor, curious moment. It confirmed everything they already believed. She was exactly who they thought she was. And so, the silence continued. The change began with the weather. A slow, gray drizzle started in the morning, blurring the sharp lines of the Crestwood Bluffs houses and turning the ocean into a misty, endless gray. By afternoon, the drizzle had become a steady, soaking rain that drummed against the huge windows of the Sterling house. It was the kind of day that made the world feel small and closed in. Leo had left early for a meeting in the city. His departure a brief storm of barking, orders into his phone, and the slam of the heavy front door. The house settled into a deep, damp quiet. The only sounds were the constant patter of the rain and the soft, rhythmic hum of the vacuum cleaner from downstairs. The housekeeper was working her way through the lower level. She was a practical woman in her late 50s who had seen many things in the homes of the wealthy. She liked Elena well enough. The new Mrs. Sterling was quiet, never made a mess, and always thanked her for the smallest things. Unlike some of the other wives, she didn't leave expensive clothes in a heap on the floor or treat the help like invisible furniture. Still, the housekeeper agreed with the general neighborhood opinion. It was a marriage of convenience. A pretty young woman from a poor country trading her care for a life of security. It was simple. A little sad, maybe, but simple. She was vacuuming the rug in the formal dining room, her thoughts on the grocery list and the stubborn stain on the guest bathroom tile. The hum of the vacuum was a mindless, familiar noise. Then, another sound cut through it, A single pure note dot, it came from the living room. It was a piano note, clear and resonant, hanging in the damp air for a long moment before it faded. The housekeeper paused, her hand on the vacuum cleaner. She must have imagined it. Mrs. Sterling never touched that piano. It was just a shiny decoration. She was about to start the vacuum again when she heard another note. And then another. Not a tune, not yet. Just separate, beautiful tones. Like someone testing the voice of a sleeping creature. Curiosity got the better of her. She switched off the vacuum. The sudden silence was heavy, filled only by the rain. And then, slowly, hesitantly, a melody began. It was unlike any music the housekeeper had ever heard in this house. There was no thumping pop beat, no soulless classical CD playing in the background. This was alive. It was a lonely, searching tune, full of spaces and sighs. It sounded the way the gray day felt beautiful, but with a deep, aching heart. She crept to the arched doorway that led to the living room, keeping herself hidden in the shadow of the hall. Elena was there. She sat perfectly straight on the piano bench, but nothing else about her was the meek woman the housekeeper knew. Her eyes were closed. Her face, usually so carefully calm, was alive with feeling, a slight frown of concentration, a softening of the lips as a sweeter phrase emerged. Her hands, those hands that usually twisted a napkin or smoothed a tablecloth, were poised over the keys. They looked strong, certain, and they moved. They flowed over the keyboard with a grace that seemed impossible. They weren't just pressing keys. They were dancing, speaking, weeping. The music swelled, a wave of such profound sadness that it clutched at the housekeeper's chest. It spoke of lost homes and old loves, of memories too painful to look at directly. Then it would fall to a whisper, a single, trembling line of notes that felt like a secret being confessed. The housekeeper stood frozen. She knew nothing about classical music. She couldn't name the piece a Chopin nocturne, though she'd never hear its name. But she didn't need to know. She could feel it. This was not someone who had learned a little tune. This was a master. This was an artist who had lived inside this music for a lifetime. The woman at the piano was a stranger. The quiet, grateful wife was gone. In her place was someone with a power and a history that filled the cold, modern room with something real and raw. Elena played on, lost in a world of her own making. A world that, for a few minutes, had nothing to do with Leo Sterling, or his money, or this rain-soaked cage of a house. She played as if she was remembering who she was. Or maybe as if she was praying. The housekeeper watched, her earlier thoughts crumbling away. This was no simple gold digger. This was a woman hiding an ocean inside her. A woman who had chosen silence, for reasons the housekeeper could only guess at. Was it shame? Fear? Or just the crushing weight of other people's small expectations? The piece moved towards its end, the notes falling like gentle tears. Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly. The final chord lingered, a bittersweet echo in the air. And then, as if a spell had broken, Elena's posture changed. She opened her eyes, blinking as if waking from a dream. She looked down at her hands on the keys, then quickly pulled them back into her lap as if they had betrayed her. She glanced around the empty room, a flicker of fear in her eyes. The housekeeper, not wanting to be caught, stepped back silently into the shadows of the hallway. Her heart was pounding. She felt like she had witnessed something sacred and something terribly private. She heard the soft click of the piano fallboard being closed. A moment later, Elena walked out of the living room. Her face was composed again, the mask back in place. But her eyes were red-rimmed. She gave the housekeeper a small, tight smile as she passed, a smile that asked for no questions, and hurried up the stairs. The housekeeper stood in the silent hall for a long time. The only sound was the rain. She looked into the living room at the sleek black piano. It didn't look like a decoration anymore. It looked like a sleeping giant, a silent witness to a secret life. She finished her work in a daze. Her mind kept returning to the music, to the transformation on Elena's face. When she left that afternoon, the secret sat heavily on her. She didn't tell anyone. It wasn't her story to tell. But the knowledge changed how she saw everything. The polite silence at dinner wasn't just quietness. It was a lid clamped down on a boiling pot. Leo's proud pats on the piano lid weren't just patronizing. They were tragically ignorant. That night, as she lay in her own bed in her small, cozy apartment, she could still hear the ghost of that haunting melody in her head. She thought of Elena, alone in that big, cold house with her gigantic secret. For the first time, she felt a surge of pity, not for the young wife trapped in a marriage of convenience, but for the brilliant artist trapped in a role that was far too small for her. The truth, she realized, was much more interesting and much sadder than the whispers had ever been. The quiet woman wasn't empty. She was full to bursting. And the housekeeper wondered how long such silence could possibly last. The secret, held tightly by the housekeeper, lived in the walls of the Sterling home for a few more weeks. It was in the careful, knowing glances she gave Elena, in the way she dusted the piano with a new kind of reverence. Elena sensed the change, a silent understanding passing between them, but neither woman spoke of it. Life, on the surface, continued its smooth, predictable course. Then came the night of the important dinner. Leo was trying to secure a partnership with a consortium of investors from South Korea. The deal was delicate, stuck on minor points of cultural nuance and trust. Leo, who believed all problems could be solved with a show of wealth and force of will, decided a lavish, intimate dinner at his home would break the ice. The house was prepared like a stage set. An expensive chef was brought in. The best crystal and china gleamed under the lights. The guests arrived, 3 serious, impeccably dressed men and their translator. Their leader was an older gentleman with a calm face and watchful eyes. He spoke little, but when he did, everyone listened. He was a man who valued substance, and he had found the flashy confidence of American business tiresome. The dinner started stiffly. Leo dominated the conversation, talking about square footage, ROI, and market domination. The Korean investors listened politely, their expressions giving nothing away. The translator worked quietly. Elena, as usual, played her part. She moved silently, ensuring wine glasses were filled, directing the serving staff with a slight nod. She wore a simple dark dress and looked, to all eyes, like the beautiful, silent accessory Leo believed her to be. As the dessert plates were cleared, the tension was palpable. The deal was not moving. Leo, feeling the stall, grew louder, more insistent. He was used to overpowering uncertainty with volume. The view here is really the selling point, he said, waving a hand towards the black windows. Absolute exclusivity. You can't put a price on that. The lead investor, the older gentleman, gave a small, polite smile. He looked around the room, his gaze traveling over the cold art, the sharp furniture, and finally, coming to rest on the sleek, black piano in the corner. It is a very fine view, he said through the translator, his voice quiet, and a very fine home. That is a beautiful instrument. A Kawai novice. My wife is a pianist. She has a similar one. Leo brightened, seeing a new opening. Is that so? Yes, it's top of the line. Cost a fortune. I believe in having the best. He walked over and gave the piano its familiar, proprietary pat. A beautiful piece, isn't it? More like sculpture. The older gentleman nodded slowly. A fine instrument deserves a voice, he said. Does anyone in the home play? In my country, we believe music reveals the soul of a house. An awkward silence fell over the room. Leo's business friends shifted in their seats. They knew the piano was for show. Leo chuckled. A strained sound. Play? Well, I'm afraid I'm all thumbs. We usually have recorded music. Maybe we should get a musician in for the next one. He laughed, but it didn't land. The Korean investors just looked at him. Waiting. The silence stretched, becoming painful. Leo's face began to flush. He was losing control of the room, and he hated it. Then, from the edge of the room, a soft voice spoke. I can play. If it is welcome. Every head turned. Elena stood by the doorway to the kitchen, her hands folded in front of her. She looked as she always did, quiet, deferential. A wave of reactions swept the table. Leo's friends and associates hid smiles behind their hands or took sudden sips of water. This was going to be a charming disaster. The poor thing was trying to help her husband and was about to embarrass them all with a clumsy nursery rhyme. Leo stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and warning. This was not the plan. The lead investor looked at Elena. He did not smile patronizingly. He simply looked at her, really looked, for the first time. He saw the stillness in her, the lack of pretense. He gave a single, gracious nod. We would be honored, he said. Trapped, Leo could only force a stiff grin. Of course. Darling, why not? A little something for our guests. The unspoken command in his eyes was clear. Make it short and simple. Elena walked to the piano. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the whisper of her dress and the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. She sat on the bench. For a moment, she was perfectly still, her back to the room. She looked at the keys, her face hidden from view. Then she took a deep breath. And as she did, something in the air shifted. It was subtle, but everyone felt it. Her shoulders, usually slightly rounded, squared. Her spine straightened, not with stiffness, but with a poised, ready strength. The quiet, fading woman seemed to grow, to fill the space around the piano. Her hands came up, hovering over the keys. They were no longer the nervous hands of a trophy wife. They were the strong, sure hands of a craftsman, a creator. And then she began. It was not chopsticks. It was not a simple tune. The first chords that crashed into the silent room were powerful, deep, and complex. They were a storm breaking over a mountain. It was music that demanded attention, that pulled the air from your lungs. It was Rachmaninoff. The sheer physical power of it shook the glasses on the table. The guests jerked in their seats, stunned. Leo's jaw went slack. His friend, the one who had called a rival soft, spilled his brandy. But as quickly as the storm began, it shifted. Elena's hands flew across the keyboard, a blur of impossible speed and precision, then fell to a whisper, drawing out a melody of such heartbreaking beauty that it felt like a physical ache. The music swelled with passion, then retreated into profound loneliness, then surged again with defiant hope. It told a story without words, a story of struggle, of immense sadness, of fragile, soaring joy. The lead investor from Korea did not move. A tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He was not listening to a performance. He was witnessing a soul speaking its truth. He saw a lifetime of discipline, of feeling, of hidden history poured into this moment. The cold, showy house, the blustering host, the expensive food, it all fell away. All that was real was this woman and the universe she was creating from wood, wire, and ivory. Elena played on, lost to the room, to her husband's shocked face, to everything but the conversation between her heart and the music. The piece, monumental and demanding, flowed from her as naturally as breathing. The final minutes were a cascade of notes, a triumphant, roaring ascent that ended with two firm, resonant chords that seemed to hang in the air long after her hands had still silence dotted deep. Thick, stunned silence. Then the lead investor slowly began to clap. Not a polite golf clap, but a solid, respectful applause from his seat. His colleagues joined him, their faces filled with awe. Leo's friends, recovering from their shock, clapped too, their expressions confused and bewildered. Leo just stared at his wife, the woman he had bought a piano for as a decoration, the woman he thought he understood. He looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time. The pieces did not fit. The quiet companion, the grateful immigrant, could not contain the colossal talent that had just shaken his house. He felt a strange, cold feeling in his stomach, the feeling of realizing he had been living next to a locked room, and the door had just been blown off its hinges. Elena turned on the bench. The powerful artist was gone, receding like a tide. Her face was pale, drained. She looked at the room full of shocked faces, her eyes finally landing on Leo's. There was no pride in her gaze, no defiance. There was only a quiet vulnerability and a question. The mask was off, and she was waiting to see what would happen now. The lead investor stood. He walked over to her, ignoring Leo completely. He bowed slightly, a gesture of deep respect. "Thank you," he said in careful English, not needing the translator. That was not a performance. That was a gift. "You have shown us the true heart of this house." He then turned to Leo, who was still frozen. His face was no longer politely guarded. It was open, warm with understanding. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "we will finalize the papers tomorrow. Your vision," he said, glancing at Elena, "has great depth. We trust a man whose home holds such authenticity." The dinner was over. The deal was made. But as the guests left, buzzing with talk of the incredible music, no one spoke about square footage or market share. They spoke only of the piano and of the astonishing woman who played it. Leo stood in the empty foyer, the echoes of the music and the closing door ringing in his ears. He looked at his wife, who was quietly gathering empty glasses, trying to slip back into her old role. But it was impossible. The silence had been shattered. Everything had changed. In the quiet after the storm, the house felt different. It wasn't just the absence of guests. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the music and were humming with a new, unfamiliar energy. Leo stood in the living room, watching Elena. She was mechanically stacking plates onto a tray, her movements small and precise, as if trying to shrink back into the invisible role she'd occupied for so long. He didn't know what to say. Something was what came out, his voice oddly flat. Elena just nodded, not meeting his eyes. "I will clean this." "Leave it," he said, more sharply than he intended. He took a breath. "Just leave it for now." She stopped, her hands hovering over a wine glass. The silence between them was thick, charged with everything that had just happened. The man who always had a command, an opinion, a deal to close, was utterly lost. The truth came out in pieces over the next few days. It wasn't a grand confession. It was Leo, for the first time, asking quiet questions, and Elena hesitantly offering fragments of a past life. She was not just from somewhere in the East. She was from Kyiv. The piano wasn't a hobby. It had been her life since she was 4 years old. She showed him a single, faded photo she kept in a book. A serious-eyed teenager in a formal dress backstage at a concert hall, holding a bouquet. She had been a prodigy, they said. She had studied at the best conservatory. A bright future was mapped out, but then the world shifted. First, a bad fall that damaged her wrist. Not enough to end her playing, but enough to steal the effortless, fearless confidence of a prodigy. Then, the political climate in her homeland changed, bringing instability and scarcity. Opportunities dried up. Her family struggled. The dream of a concert career, always a fragile thing, crumbled under the weight of practical survival. She came to America for a fresh start and found only a series of dead-end jobs and a deep, protective silence. Meeting Leo had seemed like safety. A harbor. She had locked away the part of her that ached for the music, thinking it was the price for peace. "I did not mean to deceive," she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper. It was just from another life. It did not seem to belong here. Leo listened. The man who had bought her a piano as a status symbol felt a shame so deep it was a physical pain. He had patted that lid, boasting of its cost, while a genuine artist sat silently beside him. He had mistaken her quietness for emptiness. He had shown off his wealth, thinking it was the most impressive thing in the room, while the most impressive thing had been hiding in plain sight, buried under his own assumptions. The change in him was slow but real. He stopped talking about the price of things. He found himself listening more, not just to her words, but to the spaces between them. He had the piano tuned by a specialist who came and worked with reverence. He didn't just pat the lid anymore. He sometimes just looked at it with a new understanding. One afternoon, he came home early. From the hallway, he heard the piano. Not the thunderous Rachmaninoff of that night, but something simpler, slower. A gentle, exploring melody that seemed to be thinking out loud. He peeked into the room. Elena was playing, her eyes on the music sheet before her, a pencil in her hand. She would play a few bars, stop, scribble a note, then play again. "What is that?" he asked, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, but didn't close the book. "An idea, a small piece I am. Trying to remember." He didn't ask if she was composing. He just said, "It sounds nice." And for the first time, it was a real compliment, not a patronizing one. He did something then he'd never considered before. He consulted her. The Korean deal had gone through, and the lead investor had specifically mentioned the artistic vision as a point of trust. When Leo was planning a new luxury development, he found himself asking Elena, "What do people need to feel in a space? Not just what looks expensive." She thought about it. "Light," she said, "and somewhere quiet. A room to think." He found an architect who specialized in calm, human-centered design. The biggest shift was with his children. They came for a Sunday lunch, the air stiff with the old, unspoken judgments. After the meal, Leo didn't retreat to his study. Instead, he said to Elena, "Would you play that little thing you were working on? The one with the light melody?" His children exchanged a look. "Here we go," it said. The obligatory display. Elena played her small, original piece. It was not a showstopper. It was thoughtful, elegant, and deeply felt. When she finished, there was no roaring applause, just a quiet moment. His daughter, the sharper one, was the first to speak. "That was beautiful. I didn't know you played like that." "There is much you do not know," Leo said gently, but firmly. It was not a reprimand to them, but an admission of his own failure. Later, his son pulled him aside. "Dad, that was serious. Who is she, really?" Leo looked at his wife, who was showing his grandchildren the different sounds the piano pedals could make. The little girl was laughing, as Elena made the notes sound like a ghost. "She's Elena," he said simply. And for the first time, he felt he was starting to understand what that meant. The whispers in Crestwood Bluffs didn't die. They transformed. The story of the gold digger was gone, replaced by a more intriguing, almost mythical tale. Asterisk, did you hear about Leo Sterling's wife? She's a concert-level pianist. She played for some Asian investors, and they signed a deal on the spot. People now looked at her with curiosity, with respect. They invited her not as Leo's +1, but for herself. She started giving occasional private lessons to a few dedicated children in the neighborhood, finding a deep joy in passing on the language of music. One evening, months after the fateful dinner, Leo came home to find the house empty. A note on the kitchen counter read, "In the studio." He walked to the soundproofed room he'd had built for her at the back of the house. The door was ajar. He didn't go in. He just stood and listened. She was practicing. Not a famous piece by a dead composer, but her own music. It was a conversation between sorrow and hope, between memory and the present moment. It was the sound of someone who was no longer hiding. He thought about the journey. He had wanted a quiet companion, and he had gotten one, but not in the way he imagined. The silence had been inside her, a sea of unsaid things and unplayed music. He had wanted to show off his beautiful things, and he did, but the most beautiful thing had been her talent, hidden in plain sight. He had thought he was providing everything, and he had provided the stage, quite by accident, for her to finally reveal herself. The music from the studio swelled, a complex, joyful pattern of notes. Leo leaned against the wall, a small, genuine smile on his face. The deal with the Koreans had been profitable. The new architectural designs were winning awards. But none of that felt like winning anymore. This felt like winning. This quiet, listening moment in a hallway. He had married a woman everyone thought was simple, and she had turned out to be the most complex, fascinating person he had ever known. And her piano, the expensive gift he'd given to decorate his life, had become the doorway to hers. The astonishment of that night hadn't just been for the dinner guests. It was for him, for his children, for the whole neighborhood. And most of all, he realized, listening to the confident, creative music flowing from the room, it had been for her.